Hi, Elementary Lit. So this is part 2 of our book about Hannibal, Rome's worst nightmare, and we're going to be reading chapters 5 through 9 for this week. Chapter 5, to Rome. Hannibal begins a long march into the mountains. Hannibal's army reassembled at New Carthage in the spring of 218 BC. Word had arrived from Carthage they were officially at war with the Roman Republic. Hannibal was eager to take the fight to Rome, and in his mind there was only one route available. Rome's navy controlled the seas. He would have to march into Italy by land. Hannibal's soldiers must have thought their commander was crazy. It was 1,500 miles from New Carthage to Rome. First, they would have to travel through dangerous and little-known parts of northern Iberia. Then they would climb over 2 soaring, snow-covered mountain ranges, the Pyrenees and the Alps, and it would be one of the most daring military feats ever attempted. Or perhaps the most foolish. But Hannibal was determined as he prepared for the journey. He had his men gather massive amounts of food and supplies. He sent scouts into northern Iberia to find the best routes and try to gain the support of local chieftains. The most powerful of the chiefs were paid to ensure the army's safe passage. It was decided that Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal Barca, would stay behind with 17,500 men to guard New Carthage. In April, Hannibal led 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and a few dozen elephants out of New Carthage and headed for the Pyrenees Mountains. They marched northward in a column that stretched for 5 miles. It was a massive force, but Hannibal knew that many would be lost to battle, disease, and exhaustion by the time they reached Italy. The soldiers were racing against time. They had to cross the Pyrenees quickly and reach the towering Alps before early snows blocked their passage. With Hannibal driving them, they covered about 12 miles a day. Along the way, Hannibal encountered resistance from several villages. His men fought fiercely and conquered each one. After each battle, Hannibal left soldiers behind to secure the villages. Throughout the summer, word spread among the Iberians and Celts that the invaders and their general were invincible. As Hannibal swept north and east, many tribes began to believe he was a kind of god. Many of his men, too, came to believe he was divinely inspired. Their belief only strengthened their loyalty to Hannibal. But that loyalty would be sorely tested during the hardships ahead. Chapter 6, Battle on the Rhone. A sneak attack gets Hannibal out of a jam, but the Romans are in hot pursuit. In the late summer of 218 BC, Hannibal and his men reached the foothills of the Pyrenees at the eastern edge of Iberia. At least 10,000 of his soldiers were dead. More than 10,000 others had been left behind to defend newly conquered territory. Thousands more had deserted. The 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants that remained formed an experienced and deadly fighting unit. Before climbing the Pyrenees, the army rested beside the sunny Mediterranean. They bathed in the blue water and ate well. When Hannibal gave the order, they trudged into the mountains. Snow lay on the peaks, but the summer weather allowed for easy hiking. With a few bribes and minor skirmishes, the mountain tribes let them pass. And here's a picture of Hannibal meeting with some of the tribes along the way. When the army descended the slopes into southwestern Gaul, present-day France, they were in good spirits. The arrival of a huge army caused alarm and hostility among the local Gauls. Hannibal called a meeting with several chieftains and won permission to pass without a fight. But when the army reached the banks of the Rhone River 2 weeks later, they found a surprise waiting for them. A Gaelic tribe called the Volcae had gathered on the opposite shore, and they did not look friendly. Hannibal formed a plan. He paid local tribesmen to build rafts for his troops. Then he sent a party of Iberian infantry and cavalry to cross secretly upriver. While he waited for them to get in position, his Gaelic soldiers carved crude canoes from tree trunks. As Hannibal prepared his army, he made sure the Volcae could see his men prepare for the crossing. Almost a week after arriving at the river's edge, Hannibal saw the signal he was waiting for. A column of white smoke rose in the distance to let him know the Iberian party he had sent upriver was ready to sweep down on the Volcae in a surprise attack. He ordered the first canoes into the water. The men paddled their boats against the current. Cavalry horses and pack animals swam alongside them. And here's a picture of Hannibal's war elephants crossing the Rhone River. It says that elephants were actually afraid of the water. The Volcae swarmed out of their camp to occupy the beach, shouting and waving swords and spears. As Hannibal's army paddled toward the shore, they saw their general's plan go into action. A portion of the Iberian cavalry he had sent upriver stormed the Volcae camp and set fire to it. The fire drew many of the Volcae away from the river. At that moment, the rest of Hannibal's ambushers rushed down onto the beach. Carthaginians and Volcae hacked at one another with short swords. The first wave of paddling soldiers soon landed their boats and charged into the fight. Hit from two directions, the Volcae broke ranks and ran for their lives. Hannibal's cheering soldiers welcomed wave after wave of crossing comrades until darkness fell. Celebration in the commander's tent was short-lived. Hannibal's scouts informed him that a sizable Roman army had arrived at the mouth of the Rhone, 4 days' ride to the south. Hannibal immediately sent 500 Numidian cavalry to scout the enemy. The Roman army belonged to a consul or leader named Publius Scipio. Scipio had set sail from Italy with plans to confront Hannibal in Iberia. When Scipio docked in Gaul to load supplies, local Gallic leaders told him that Hannibal had already crossed the Pyrenees. Scipio was shocked. He sent several hundred of his own cavalry galloping north with orders to find the army of Carthage. As Hannibal's men prepared to continue toward the Alps, part of the Numidian scouting party thundered back into camp. They breathlessly described being surprised by Scipio's cavalry. A bloody battle had left 200 Numidians dead. The Romans had pursued the survivors to Carthage's camp before turning back. Hannibal was certain that the Romans would arrive in a few days. He considered preparing a trap, but he could not afford to wait. It would soon be snowing in the Alps. He gave the order to pack up. When the Romans arrived several days later, they found the Carthaginian campfires long cold. Chapter 7, Over the Alps. After 2 more weeks of marching, the exhausted army of Carthage reached the looming Alps, only to find another obstacle in their way. They had entered the land of the fierce and powerful Allobroges Celts. Hannibal's scouts found an Allobroges army patrolling the rocky slopes above the trail into the mountains. Hannibal sent the scouts back to spy on the Allobroges. The spies returned to report. There's another picture for you. The spies returned to report that the Allobroges guarded the trail only during daylight. Each night they went home to their villages. Hannibal saw his chance. To convince the Allobroges that he had settled in for the night, Hannibal ordered his army to set up camp and build cooking fires. After dark, he led a few thousand men up to the positions abandoned by the Allobroges. At dawn, the rest of the army formed a column and began climbing the narrow trail, which overlooked a deep gorge. Seeing the Carthaginians on the move, the Allobroges sounded an alarm and scrambled for their posts. When they found Hannibal and his men already occupying the high ground, the stunned Celts hesitated. They looked up at Carthage's soldiers, then down at the long column of men and pack animals. Before Hannibal could attack, the Allobroges began rolling boulders and hurling rocks at the column below. Chaos broke out as terrified soldiers and beasts scrambled to escape the avalanche. Many fell into the gorge or were crushed by the rocks. The Allobroges Celtic warriors, here's a picture of them preparing to roll the rocks down onto the Carthaginian army. Before his men suffered crippling losses, Hannibal led a charge from above and scattered the Allobroges. The Carthaginian army had been weakened, but not broken. They camped in the Allobroges villages for 3 days and feasted on grain and beef. Before setting out again, they seized horses to replace the ones the Allobroges had killed. The army now climbed higher and higher into the mountains. Winter was coming on fast, and the mountain air turned frigid. The men gasped for air as they trudged higher. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. Food had to be carefully rationed to make sure it lasted until they reached Italy. Every day, men and animals plunged thousands of feet to their deaths. Even more died from illness and the brutal cold. Exhausted soldiers slid off the trail and froze where they lay. After more than 10 days of climbing on frostbitten feet, the army at last reached the summit of the Alps. Hannibal stopped to rest his sick and tired men. A blizzard battered the camp with fierce winds and snow. Here's a drawing of what it might have looked like up at the top of those Alps as they crossed over. Sensing that his men were on the edge of despair, Hannibal knew he needed to do something. After the deadly blizzard passed, he brought his soldiers forward to a peak that overlooked lush green fields of the Po Valley. Hannibal gathered his strength and thundered, "You are now crossing the barriers, not only of Italy, but of Rome itself. Henceforth, all will be smooth and easy for you. In 1, or at the most 2 battles, you will be masters of the capital and the stronghold of Italy." There's a picture of him showing them, pointing out, see those beautiful lands down there? That's where we're headed. As the men gazed at the valley, imagining the fresh loot and supplies to be found there, they began to cheer. Word spread through the ranks that the end of their journey was just a few days' march away. After a 5-day descent, the army of Carthage finally camped in the Green Valley. They had traveled 5 months from New Carthage to Italy. The losses were enormous. Only 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry remained. Half the elephants were dead. Hannibal's army was much smaller, but its ranks held some of the strongest, most loyal soldiers a general ever commanded. And then there's a few pictures here. This is just different things from Hannibal and Carthage. Just gonna show those. Okay. So different pictures of Hannibal, and oh, there's some more. Here's some of an elephant, the journey that they were on. And some more. Okay, so that kind of gives a summary of the whole story, but we're going to keep moving on from where we were. So chapter 8 is called Conquer or Die. Hannibal, it seemed, had achieved the impossible, but the toughest task still lay ahead, facing the great Roman legions. 4,200 strong divisions of armored infantry armed with javelins and short stabbing swords. Before meeting the Romans on the battlefield, Hannibal needed food and reinforcements for his 26,000 starving men and animals. He approached a tribe of local Gauls, the Tyrrhenes, and encouraged them to rise up against the Romans and join the army of Carthage. The Tyrrhene chieftains refused. They were too busy fighting neighboring tribes. Angry and in need of supplies, Hannibal decided to make an example of the Tyrrhenes. His men surrounded their hilltop village. After a 3-day siege, they stormed up the hill and massacred everybody they could find. Hannibal surveyed the town's smoldering ruins while his army devoured the food the Tyrrhenes had stored for winter. While the men rested, Hannibal's scouts brought news of the Roman army led by Scipio. The Romans had learned of the Carthaginians' arrival. Scipio was closing in fast, eager to catch the invaders before they regained their strength. To inspire his soldiers for the coming battle, Hannibal provided them with a bloody spectacle. Prisoners seized during fighting in the Alps were brought back before the army in chains. Hannibal asked them which would be willing to fight a fellow prisoner to the death. The victor, he explained, would win his freedom and a horse. All the prisoners begged for the chance to fight. Several pairs chosen by lottery fought before the assembled army. The soldiers enjoyed it. As promised, the survivors were released. Now Hannibal addressed his men. "Soldiers, you have seen in the fate of others an example of how to conquer or die," he said. The men roared their approval. Hannibal went on to explain that the men were in the same situation as the prisoners. Italy was surrounded by water and mountains. They had no escape route. On this spot, where you will for the first time encounter the enemy, you must conquer or die. The men roared again, anxious for the chance to fight. In a matter of days, they got their wish. Hannibal found Scipio's army camped near the Ticinus River. He moved the army of Carthage into position on the other side of the water. The Romans built a temporary bridge and crossed it to an open field. Hannibal watched them come, their helmets and breastplates gleaming, marching in perfect formation. They were the best trained, most disciplined soldiers in the world. But Hannibal was confident. He lined his men up in standard battle formation, infantry in the center, cavalry at either side. At last, Hannibal would have his chance to spill Roman blood. As was the custom, the battle began when the opposing cavalries raced onto the open ground and clashed. Soon, Hannibal's powerful Numidian horsemen broke through and scattered the Roman infantry. The horsemen chased down hundreds of Romans and slashed them as they fled. Hannibal's infantry surged forward to join the fight, but Scipio quickly pulled his troops back across the river and destroyed the bridge to prevent the Carthaginians from following. Scipio was wounded during the retreat and would have been taken prisoner but for the aid of his 17-year-old son. The young soldier, also named Publius Scipio, persuaded a group of Romans to race with him into the fighting and rescue his father. It would not be the last time that young Scipio led a charge against Hannibal's men. In the end, the defeat was a minor one for Rome. Still, Hannibal had proven that he would not easily be beaten. The Romans retreated to a heavily fortified camp near the Trebia River. Hannibal led his army westward along the Po River along the Po River in pursuit. When he found the Romans, he boldly demanded that the elder Scipio leave his fortified camp and come to the battlefield for a full-scale fight on level ground. Perhaps there, Hannibal would get his first true taste of victory. The Battle of Trebia, Chapter 9. Camped on the banks of the Trebia River, Scipio ignored Hannibal's call for a fight. He was determined to give himself and his men a rest. It wasn't long before a group of Scipio's Gallic soldiers disturbed his plan. The Gauls took notice of Hannibal's strength and decided they would be better off fighting for Carthage. One night, they murdered a group of sleeping Roman soldiers. They raced into Hannibal's camp, carrying the Romans as proof that they were not spies. Hannibal ordered the Gauls to return to their village and recruit fellow tribesmen who were ready to rise up against their Roman rulers. The desertion of the Gauls left Scipio in a dangerous position. He could no longer trust the loyalty of the local tribes. Fearing an attack, the Roman Senate sent its second consul, Sempronius, and his army to aid Scipio. As required by Roman law, Scipio and Sempronius alternated command of the combined armies. Scipio led the forces one day, Sempronius the next. Scipio was a cautious man, reluctant to fight unless he had a clear advantage. Sempronius, by contrast, was impatient, eager for a victory to increase his prestige in Rome. Knowing his enemy, Hannibal decided to lure Sempronius into battle. Hannibal's camp looked across a wide field, perfect for Carthage's cavalry, and thick bushes nearby could hide a small army. Hannibal placed his brother Mago and several thousand of his best soldiers in the bushes. He would lure the Romans onto the chosen battlefield and then spring an ambush. On a morning of Sempronius's command, Hannibal saw to it that his soldiers awoke early and ate a good breakfast. It was a cold day in late December 218 BC. His men warmed themselves by roaring fires and rubbed their limbs with heated oil. They were ready to fight. Hannibal then sent 1,000 cavalry toward the enemy camp. Roman bugles blared an alarm. Just as Hannibal had hoped, Sempronius ordered his sleepy army into battle. The two sides met on the field Hannibal had chosen. Carthage's 28,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry faced 36,000 Roman infantry and 4,000 cavalry. Cold, tired, and hungry, the Romans launched a frontal assault. The hand-to-hand combat was brutal. Neither force could gain an advantage. Hannibal broke the stalemate by sending his cavalry into battle with a line of elephants thundering in front. The Romans were terrified. Many of them had never seen an elephant before. The Roman cavalry panicked and fled. Hannibal's elephants and horsemen then wheeled around and attacked the exposed Roman infantry. At the same time, Mago sprang his ambush. A storm of spears and rocks hit the Romans from behind as Mago's men burst from their hiding places and plunged into the fight. Surrounded, the legions fought bravely. About 10,000 Romans managed to hack through the Carthaginian line and make their way to a nearby village. The rest grew too weary to fight. By the time the fighting ended, 1/3 of Sempronius's force had been killed. In little more than a month, Hannibal had swept down from the Alps and torn apart the best of the Roman legions. At the Ticinus River, Scipio had gotten a small taste of the general's military genius. Now, Sempronius had felt the full power of the battle-hardened army of Carthage, complete with the fearsome Numidian cavalry and gigantic thundering elephants. It must have seemed as though Hannibal had come to Italy not out of the mountains, but from another world. And that's the end of chapter 9.